Good afternoon, Shulem. Good afternoon, all the virtual audience of our virtual meeting. I'm very happy, I'm honored I'm able to be a moderator for this conversation with an esteemed author of very important book. One of the most important contributions to our understanding of 21st century American Hasidism, I believe. To be sure, this is not an academic analysis. This is the book of insider and outsider looking on this community, but and to me as a historian this is kind of unusual situation. I usually cope with dead Hasidim. I'm so sorry to say so, we historians usually don't deal with people who are alive, so to me it is even more interesting and it's even more stimulating. Thank you for accepting this invitation. I'm very happy and I'm looking forward to hear what you have to answer also to my historical questions. The book is inviting so much of the topics. We'll be speaking about your memoir, All Who Goes Do Not Return, which was published in 2015 in English, and now this is appearing as Kto odejdzie już nie wróci in Polish translation by Barbara Gadomska. The book in the Polish version was also edited by the outstanding academic scholar Wojciech Tworek, one of the best specialists on Hasidism in the 20th and 21st century. So in Polish edition, even if you don't know about topography of Borough Park or you don't understand certain Hasidic customs, you beautifully navigate and you understand what the book is talking about. So this is an important book. It is on the back cover. It is advertised as the memoir of your slow and painful way out from the Hasidic community. Would you like to say something more, to add something as a way of introduction of what the book that we are talking about is?
Sure. Well, first let me say it is a great honor to be interviewed by you. The honor is absolutely mine. Your reputation precedes you, and I've seen so much of your work. I wish I could say that I know all of your work, but I will one day get to really delving in. But I've enjoyed a lot of things that have your name attached to it. The book Hasidism, I'm not sure if you had a part in that. Hasidism. You were one of them, yeah. I did a review of that book. Yeah, so it's a great pleasure and a great honor, and it's particularly a very special pleasure to me to be speaking to a Polish-speaking audience, Polish reading audience, because I think Polish Jewish history is incredibly important. It's fundamental to understanding Ashkenazi Jewry. And I wish that there would be more awareness of this connection. Ashkenazi Jewish history is inextricably intertwined with Polish history, in my opinion, in my belief. And as a historian, you can confirm whether that is true or not. But that's what I feel and what I've thought. So just wanted to say that. And of course, thank you for having me. In terms of introduction to what the book is about. Well, it's been some time since I wrote it. I finished writing it in 2014. And in 2014, it was already years after many of the events took place. So my own feelings regarding my story have shifted over time. So the answer I might have given in 2015 or 2016 might not be the same answer as I would give now. But what I would say now is that it is a book. It is a book about. It is a book about finding a refuge from alienation, which is something that I didn't see earlier on, and I've realized only after time went on that my essential crisis was one not so much of non-belief, but of non-belief in an environment that will not accept your non-belief. Because if they would have accepted my non-belief, I would have had no problem, because I like the people in my former Hasidic community, or at least some of them. My family is there, my children are there, and I would have much preferred to still be to not be persona non grata in that community.
Mhm.
So the reason I had to leave was because they rejected me. So it was less me extricating myself from an environment that I found oppressive, and more I was pushed out. And I've come to see this more and more over the years, that it was this feeling of alienation in that environment that I could no longer tolerate.
The book actually makes it very clear that at a certain point they want you out. It's not that you decide to leave.
Yes.
They ask you, as Deen, for those that did not read the book, the Shulem to come, and they announce him. He's not allowed to leave in the village of Square. So
yeah,
that's
actually the very first
clear.
chapter.
But the way, and it also reappears later on as another important part. So this is in some way arranged around this, and it raises my 2 points. What you've just said, that the kind of gravity of the book is towards what you are feeling towards the later part of this book, and not what you are referring from the beginning. But you are saying you would be perfectly fine to stay there if they accept your disbelief. You really think this is about your disbelief, or it's about the social consequences of disbelief, the way you behave or the way you believe? Because this is not necessarily so. I'm also referring to what you wrote about your relation with your wife. Extremely captivating description, and to me it was very moving, because it's so fair treatment of a person that you were in conflict when writing those things. But you very nicely presented her as a fair woman was trying to cope with your disbelief, as far as it did not interfere social relations between you and the community. So it's not the disbelief as such. Am I right?
That is correct. It is not disbelief as such. And I might have been inclined to say that it was a little more than I am now. So of course, everything is always about a lot of things. Everything is always complex. Every phenomenon has multiple causes and things like that. But I think that in this case, it is a lot more about the consequences of behavior. Absolutely. But in this community, they see belief as behavior. And so if you say you don't believe, if someone doesn't believe but they don't speak of it and nobody knows, it's not a problem. But what they object to is the knowledge that you are a disbeliever. You need to keep that to yourself. And I was not willing.
Let's consider, Shulem, let's consider a very hypothetical situation. They know you are a disbeliever, but you behave perfectly like Chosid. You don't watch TV, you don't use internet, you don't eat non-kosher. Would it be still a problem, a major problem? You will be still an apikoros? I think so.
That was the case with me. I was not eating non-kosher, not at that time. I was pretty much just going with the program. I had no attraction to things that were forbidden, except I didn't think they were forbidden. But I didn't particularly need a cheeseburger. I didn't need, to drive my car on Shabbos. I was perfectly happy with having Shabbos, 24 hours, 26 hours of downtime. No computers, no phones. I was happy with that. So I had no problem with going by the rules.
Many of us dream of having 26 hours without incoming calls, so that's something different.
Yes,
that's true.
Yes. I recently thought a Sabbath observance could benefit a lot of people in the world today.
Jews and non-Jews, that's right. What's interesting to me in the book might be an aspects that are not at the forefront, but they are interesting for a person that is trying to see it in context of Hasidism, in wider context of historical development, of contemporary Hasidism. When you were giving a kind of short introduction to what the book is, you focus on the way out as the person writing the blurb for the book. But to me, equally interesting in the book was your way in. You are not Skvirek Hasid at the beginning of this story. And actually, to me, it extends also in the story of your father. Captivating story, again, something that you give a glimpse of, but we don't know, we don't learn all the way of of this person, God's Hasid. So actually, you would say nobody's Hasid, maybe, right? In Hasidic word, his way into Hasidism. And I would also ask, sorry for being so much historian, grandparents' way into Hasidism. So where it comes from, how it comes that you, from a son of God's Hasid, are becoming Kfirer Hasid, and all people around you, because from what I understand about your siblings also, they also, one of the brothers is in Square now, right? Others are in Monsey. So they, so this is coming into closer connection to the Hasidic world. So this is the story of way in and way out. Could you tell us more? It's not so much in the book, and it was so interesting to me to know about this way in, how you see it. The longer run, I mean.
Yeah. Well, maybe a good place to start actually is with parents and grandparents. My parents decided to join the Hasidic world when they were young. My father was in his 20s, and he started studying Judaism and Jewish mysticism. He was not raised in a religious Jewish environment, nor was my mother. And they both became attracted to ultra-Orthodox Judaism and ultimately to Hasidic Judaism after they encountered, I would say, various sort of interesting figures, one of which was Zalman Shechter Shalom, which I'm certain you are familiar with, and another was Shlomo Carlebach. They both knew both of them during formative periods of their entry into Hasidic Judaism. But by the time, and just to go back one more, my father's background was just sort of very American, many generations, not. And I don't know that much. He's no longer alive, so I don't have a very good sense of his family history. But my mother's family history goes to the Ukraine, where my family her entire family were very fervent and devout Hasidim. They lived in, most of them in a little village called Yampol, which is not far from Kremenetz. And they were Karlin Hasidim. And Karlin, as you, I'm certain, will know, was a very, very prominent Hasidic sect, Hasidic group. Certainly back in Eastern Europe, even today, it's not small potatoes, but it is certainly a major group, and especially its leaders were iconic, especially in the early years of the Hasidic movement. So to me, that's a source of pride that my grandfather, my great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, they used to travel to the Rebbes of Karlin and Stolin, which are both sort of connected. And to me, that was always very, very meaningful growing up. But my parents, they made their entry into a contemporary Hasidic world that is a lot less monolithic than people think. My parents entered the world of Satmar, or the closest I could say is the world of Satmar. Now, Satmar is a Hungarian group, not a Polish, not Ukrainian. So it has a very different shape of their approach to Hasidism. And their approach was one that never suited me. It's austere, it's severe, it is, they are fiercely anti-Zionist to the point of violence. Satmar also is known for approving of violence in certain situations in ways that most other Hasidic groups are not. So I never found the Satmar group inspiring. While my parents did join it, they also were in it with one eye half skeptic. So they saw this world as a beautiful world and one they wanted to join, but they were not completely naive about its harsher sides. I think they didn't know it completely, but I think they were able to sort of maintain an attitude of, this is the community we want to belong in, but certain small things we don't necessarily agree with everyone. And some of that was about the relationship to the world, relations with non-Jews, a general whether a universalist perspective has a place within traditional ultra-Orthodox Judaism, which my father very strongly believed that it does. He strongly believed that Judaism generally, and Hasidism and Jewish mysticism more particularly, have something to say even to the non-Jewish world. And he had a lot of respect to those who were seeking that. So in that respect, they were very different from the rest of the surroundings, but I was still a child, so I wasn't very philosophical about any of this. I couldn't explain to you that our Hasidic community of Satmar was different from the Hasidic community of New Square until adulthood. Today, I could make a very, very fine distinction. But back when I joined the Skvera community, all it was a different group with, slightly taller hats, wearing their side calls in a different style. And they had a different attitude to their Rebbe, a somewhat more intense, somewhat more, we might say somewhat more cultish, certainly in terms of cult of personality than in Satmar. So these were little things that I'd noticed, but it wouldn't be until adulthood.
Sorry for interrupting, but do you remember still Yoelish Teitelbaum? This is important. Do you see the difference in Satmar attitude toward the leader at the time of Yoel Teitelbaum and later on, or you just speaking about later periods? When you compare Satmar and Square, which Satmar you are comparing? Before 79 or after 79?
So all I know is after 79. Well, I should say I know before 79 from because I know the history of Satmar, but I don't have a personal experience with Satmar from before 79 because I was only born in 74. So while my father sort of felt mostly ideologically aligned with Satmar, we weren't integrated into the Satmar world per se. We were more connected to a community that you might call a satellite community, or a sort of a community in Satmar's orbit, which is Krasna, which is named after a town in Romania. The ideology of this group is very very similar to the Satmar, and it is from the Satmar ideology that they take theirs. They're not really an independent group sect. They're just an independent community within Satmar's orbit, if that makes any sense. The topology can
very much. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
No, it's very interesting because also it allows us to understand the structuring of the Hasidic community today. Fascinating issue for many, at least for me.
Yeah. So just going back to sort of my discovery of Hasidism, it wasn't until I joined the Skvera community in New Square that I began to appreciate what Hasidism was. Because as a child, I simply grew up in what we might call a Hasidic world, but a Hasidic world is not necessarily Hasidism as the teachings are understood. There's a sort of sociological, anthropological component to the Hasidic world, and then there is the philosophical, theological, ideological components, and sometimes they match up and sometimes they go different ways. So as a child, I had no understanding of Hasidic teachings as I understand them now, and actually could not figure out how they relate to the Hasidic world that I was in as a child, because they seemed completely different. Classic Hasidism emphasizes joy and ecstasy and a complete sort of abrogation of the self in the face of the Ein Sof, the eternal. In the Satmar community, it's all about just being really strict about halakha. That's what it seemed to me, really strict, sort of, going farther than the strictest. So all it seemed was just a very, very austere movement rather than one that had joy in it. And it was only when I joined the Skveras that I found the joy of Hasidism. And I don't want to say that Satmar doesn't have it at all, but when I was growing up, I think when I was growing up, Satmar as a community was very, very weak in terms of their leader was not nearly as charismatic or even interesting, I would say, as Rabbi Yoelish, who came before. And today I think Satmar is stronger in its own sense of where it belongs in the Hasidic landscape. But I think when I was a child, Satmar itself was in something of a crisis, I think. Mm-hmm. I think in a way that ironically now, after Satmar split into two factions, I think this has actually made two much more healthy movements out of a larger dysfunctional one. But when I was a child, I had very little awareness of any of this. And New Square, the Square community, attracted me with its, you might say, with its music, not literally, but metaphorically. It's music and it's joy, it's singing, it's dancing. That drew me in as a 13-year-old child. Now, I think it's also important to note, when I was a 13-year-old child, I had very simple needs. Our family was going through something. My father was very ill, and as he would die that same year, soon after I turned 14. And in a way, I was looking for a community that would embrace me in place of my father. That was really how I would see it now in hindsight, from a sort of psychoanalytical perspective, which I think is the correct perspective in this. And so I wasn't looking for Hasidism. I was looking for people who would just open their arms to me and say, join us. And whoever that would have been, I would have gone there, because I was 13.
And what about
didn't have a father.
And what about your siblings?
So I was the oldest boy. I have an older sister, but I have two younger brothers. And the way it just happened was they followed me. So I just turned 14 when my father died. I had one brother who was 12 and then another brother who was 8. And they sort of, they needed to be guided. I needed to be guided as well, but in the absence of a father figure, they looked to me, and I moved to Skver, so they moved in that direction as well. So both of my brothers became Skver Hasidim, Skver followers. One of them lives in New Square and one in Monsey, but Monsey is very close to New Square. It's a 5-minute drive. But they both consider themselves Skver Hasidim today. And my sister was a little bit in a more liberal Hasidic environment in Borough Park. So she didn't follow me, but she was the exception.
She was the oldest also. So this is about way in of the family, and now about way out. Maybe we start also with the family. You are hinting that your family is keeping contact with you. At the same time, your siblings, you are still in contact with them. I don't mean your immediate family, but this is also not obvious, right? So is it exceptional? How did they receive? Can you tell us more about this personal story that you only hint in the book? You have 2 brothers, 1 sister who stay within Hasidic community. Obviously, they were and maybe still are under the same pressure as your ex-wife to severe contact with you and apikoires, and they do maintain it. You say in the book, your mother, however, she might feel pain because of you living in this community. She still holds close relations with you. So you were not totally cut off of your family. Can you tell us how it looks with those people that you don't mention in the book, how it looked? Your keeping contacts or severing contacts, how this way out looked in this regard?
So I think this is a sort of, I think this sheds important light on what could otherwise be seen as a fairly simple, as a sort of simplistic phenomenon. The Hasidic community did not want me, but the Hasidic community does not have hard and fast rules that everyone agrees with. So while the community in New Square, they didn't want me to live in New Square physically, it was not forbidden for my former friends to still be in touch with me. And some of them did stay in touch with me. There was a period of a period of alienation in which I felt alienated from that community, and so I pulled away. I pulled far away, and I pulled far away even from my family, as in my siblings. I did not deliberately away from them, but I needed to get far away from that whole world. So while my siblings, they did not reject me, and they were under no pressure to reject me. But I, for a time, during the first years of leaving, did sort of put some distance between us, because I had to figure out what is the role of my family in my life now that I am moving out of that world. And so it's sort of shapeshifted over time. Now my relationship with my family is very good. My mother, who lives in Jerusalem, is still very much the same as she's always been, very devout, very pious. But she does not put ideology before relationships. In fact, I would say she's not a person of ideology. And to me, there's a very important distinction that allows me to respect my mother's faith, because I see a big distinction between faith and dogma. And my mother is a person of very, very deep faith, only very weak dogma. So if you're a dogmatist, you insist on everyone doing it your way. If you're a person of faith but not much dogma, you say, I feel this is the best way for me. I wish you saw it the way I saw it, but I still respect you if you don't. That's my mother's attitude, because she is a person of faith, and my siblings generally as well. They're by temperament. I would say my family generally is inclined towards faith, but not towards dogma or ideology, and so that's allowed them to maintain a very healthy relationship with me.
And what about friends or ex-friends, maybe from the Hasidic community? Are you kind of a forbidden fruit for them, or not to touch, or I don't know, to sneak out to talk to you? How does it look?
Well, they're not forbidden. They can speak to me if they would like. But I have found that once I moved away, it was very hard for me to stay connected to my friends. There was an awkwardness that we couldn't overcome. And one thing that I have noticed with my family, not that much, but with my friends, I have noticed that those who try to maintain contact, they get very tense if I mention anything about my current lifestyle. So if I should even hint that I currently live in a neighborhood in which there are no other let alone there are very few other religious Jews, period, let alone Hasidic Jews. It's in Brooklyn, but it's not one of the Hasidic or Orthodox enclaves. And when I say this to friends, or when I hint that I don't keep kosher, don't keep Shabbos, they get very tense. They get very silent. They don't ask what is that like? They don't inquire. They want to ignore that subject. And that showed me something very important about what it is to maintain relationships with people. I think sometimes if it's a relationship in which someone is actively trying to keep you from speaking about your whole self, but only wants to know about a sort of a fractional part of you, but the other fractional part they don't know how to deal with. I think, in some cases when it's family, we sometimes don't have choice, but when we do have choice, I think sometimes we would be well advised to maybe put some distance from people who can't accept your entire self. And so I've chosen to keep those relationships because I felt they were not healthy.
And what about such controversial issues like their acceptance or disacceptance for issues that were hard for you to accept, like keeping you away from your children? They were within the community that enforced it on your immediate family, right? Staying there, right? Did those issues did emerge or not? Because I imagine this could be the major issue of controversy with friends. It's not what they don't want to hear from you about your current life, but how they approve acts against you that you consider violent and breaking essential laws of yourself and good of your children. But still they say, my community approves it and I support this. Was it the issue, or it did not arise in your contact with friends?
It didn't arise as an issue per se, spoken in that way. But it is something that I'm very fully aware is that community collectively took a position against me, even if not every person took an active position, but the community as a whole took a position against me. And generally, again, the community as a whole believed that what was done to me was the right thing. Whether some of my friends personally felt differently or not, I don't know. They haven't said. So do I hold it against them? Yes, absolutely. But I mean, I can't not. But I also still can't ignore that I have a history with them. I'd spent many years of study and in gatherings, in Hasidic gatherings, of singing and dancing and, you know, sharing meals. It's very hard to erase a part that was so formative in formative experiences. And so even though I might feel somewhat resentful that they didn't stand up for me and that they still don't stand up for me, and they think that what was done was the right thing, I have more affection for them than animus. But even if that's illogical, that is simply the way I feel, because these people as individuals were always very special to me. But collectively, they made a decision that was very harmful to me.
What you say is extremely interesting, even though not so surprising, because life is simply more complex than you can put in ideologies, and that's what you are speaking about. But this brings us to a topic that we have to speak about, as we are in secular media. We have to speak about sex and violence, of course, and those are two topics that appear in your memoir. I'm speaking only half jokingly about this pressure.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm here for. I'm here for the sex and violence part.
That's right. Sex and violence is there, and actually, violence, maybe more than sex, is something that you see from within and from outside. Something that is in a way, you've already mentioned violence, especially in Satmar, but also as something that is strongly embedded in Hasidic lifestyle today. So my question, if you look on this from outside, as you look now, do you see it as a kind of constitutive element of this world? How do you perceive importance of violence? Is it something that does happen because it happens in every community, just by slip of not following the rules, or as a rule, or what is and how important it was for you? Because you mentioned this issue of violence and your disagreement to violence, and also of your participation in violence, when you feel kind of bitterness of being violent against something or somebody, and then you realize it was not the right thing to do. But this is again how central to your experiencing of this world it was then, at that time.
The very strange thing was that when I was part of the Hasidic community, if somebody would have said to me that ultra-Orthodox Jews are violent, I would have thought they were crazy. And that was when I was in it. The reason that's important for me to say is because while it is there, it is not common. It is not an everyday thing. It happens, but the incidents are few and far between, except when they do happen, they are very memorable. So it's not that there is a lot of violence, it's that even a little bit of violence has a very strong impact. And so that's about violence generally, but also violence in the Hasidic world, and I would say generally coercive tactics, which could include physical violence, but could also include various other forms of intimidation, threats of not allowing you into the synagogue or threatening you with expelling your children from schools. those are not violent per se, but they are coercive measures. And I would say that coercive measures generally, and violence particularly, really varies from sect to sect. Some sects have a very definite and defined position on this, and some sort of just judge it on a case-by-case basis. Satmar was, in my experience, in my knowledge, in my to the degree, my familiarity with the Satmar world was one that was very, very aware of violence as an accepted tool, and one that in Satmar was used, I don't want to say frequently, but it had official sanction. For instance, it is fairly well known, I think, that the first Satmar Rebbe, the one who became Rebbe back in Satmar, in the town of Satmar, in I think it's Romania, or not Hungary.
Now it is Romania. It used to be Hungary until 1918. Incidentally, the name of Satmar in Romanian is Satu Mare, which means Holy Mary. Yeah, which is actually referring to Catholic figure of Holy Mary, of the Virgin Mary.
Which is why they sometimes actually have a variation for it. Some people in Satmar actually don't use the word Satmar. They say Sakmar, just because they don't want to say a word that is so close to Satumare, Saint Mary, as you say. But I would say in Satmar, violence, the old Satmar, the Rebbe Yoelish, the first Satmar leader, it's well known that when he first began when he first took on the mantle of leader, he had his yeshiva in the town of Satumare, and he had in some other places in Krula and certain other parts, and he encouraged his students to commit violence against those who opposed him. So that was not incidental violence, that was official violence. And I think official violence in Satmar I think it is no longer official, but its roots in official violence still manifest. New Square did not have that kind of attitude to violence. New Square generally considers itself a very sort of a community that encourages meekness, almost like a Christian kind of like turn the other cheek kind, but not using those words, but a very sort of, blessed are the meek. In a place like Skver, they would appreciate that. In a place like Satmar, they might not. But having said this, Skver too, it accepts violence because violence is part of the human landscape, and the Hasidim have not internalized that the state has a monopoly on violence, on force. As a society generally, we have not said we don't allow violence. We've said we give the state a monopoly on violence. The states can use violence against its citizens, and it can use violence against those who might threaten it. And so we even in the civilized world have not completely disavowed violence. So New Square is a community that very similarly believes that there are times when violence is necessary, but they have not conceded that violence is only in the domain of government. So to them,
of course,
it is not to them, just if the police have a right to be violent, then they too have a right to be violent against those who are committing religious transgressions. So they don't like violence. It's not something that is certainly not something that's encouraged. Certainly not.
It's fascinating what you are saying, because there is, it's paradoxical actually. You are saying in some way, if I read you properly, that your experience of violence in this community was actually so intense exactly because it was so little of it. it was not typical to use violence in New Square. When there was an episode with this car and people shouting anti-Semitic slogans at you, and people run to the street to do something, it was so intense for you because it was exceptional. That's a kind of interesting paradox in what you are saying. That actually, the low scale of violence, the low amount of violence that you would approach on everyday level, it intensified your perception when it was there. It's something I didn't think that way, but that's fascinating.
And that incident was certainly an anomalous incident. It was not anything that had happened that I had seen anything even close to it before or after. Nothing even close to it. And I lived in New Square until I was around 30, and then I lived in Muncie till around 33. And that incident happened when I was about, I want to say 2021. And all my years in the yeshiva prior to that, and all my years living there with my family after that, nothing even close. But the incident itself, as rare as it was not controversial. There was no one who said this was wrong.
This I understand. Yeah, this I understand, because the Hasidic community, as many traditional or Orthodox religious communities, do not accept the rule of transferring the right to use violence to the state completely and fully. They withhold it for certain situations, and that's typical for many situations. So that's how it manifested. But still, this is fascinating to me what you're saying, because it puts the violence. We people from outside, when we look on Hasidic world, we are often exposed to images of Satmar Hasidim burning flags of Israel on the streets of Jerusalem, or throwing stones on police forces. So this looks extremely violent. On the other hand, as a scholar of Hasidism, I know this image of Hasidim who have exactly opposite picture of themselves. And now what you're saying is somehow reconciling those two opposite images into something that is paradoxical, but actually holds water, very much so. Thank you for this. Okay, from violence to sex now.
I have some, but I do want to add something on this, because there's an important. It's a bit of a postscript, but I think it sheds light on exactly what you're saying. So in New Square, there was an incident where, after I was gone, there was a man there who wasn't following all the rules. He was praying at a different synagogue, and that's not allowed. And ultimately what happened was there was an incident in which someone tried to burn his house down. And they were not successful with burning his house down, but they were successful in inflicting severe injury. He had third-degree burns on over half of his body and was hospitalized for weeks. And it was a very, 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 very traumatic incident. And I think the Hasidic world almost universally condemned it. Now, what's interesting was that, this was committed by a young Hasid in New Square. And I do not believe that this came from higher ups or anything like that. I think he acted on his own because he felt he was defending the Rebbe's honor. But what was very telling was that when the world put pressure on New Square to condemn the incident, and to the Skvera Rebbe to condemn the work that this individual did, he did so. And what he said was that we do not agree with this because this is not our way. He meant our tradition. Some might have such traditions, but we don't really. We're not saying they're wrong, but we generally prefer nonviolence or something like that. To me, that was a very, very telling statement. He wasn't condemning it as an absolute atrocity. He was simply saying, it's not our custom.
Yeah, but still condemned it.
Which means
still condemned it.
Which means, right, and still condemned it. But to say it's not our custom. To me, that was sort of walking that line that is precisely what you're saying is what makes it complex. He said it was not good at the same time that he was saying that he was acknowledging that some, in some circumstances, would use it, and he does not philosophically or ideologically stand in principled opposition to the use of violence ever. It was just sort of like, we generally avoid it if we can. I think that, to me, that was interesting. And now we can speak about
this story. Yeah, now I'm listening to this story as a postscript from Poland, at which monstrous acts by the Catholic clergy cannot get condemned by the hierarchy of the church, because it's anash, it's ours people. They did it, but they are ours still. So it's not so easy to condemn. Right. So I'm impressed by the fact he was condemned, even if mildly and not so clearly, but still there was a condemnation. It's already much. To me, it is already much. Yeah, that's right. Sex.
Public opinion was very much against them. Public opinion was very much against them, so they felt a lot of pressure from the outside.
Okay. So sex. It's important part of your book, but I must say that I did not understand this position, because it's in some way you very clearly present it as the way it's your Hasidic experience, the way you are afraid of, fascinated, typical boyish dreams, nightmares, and then very slow, at moments painful way into getting into marital union. It's done with I think with great care for actually very deep and truthful depicting of what is the importance of this for the way how a Hasidic boy would experience it, and you take yourself as an example. It's very convincing, but as at the final resort, I'm not sure whether you talk about it as a normative way the Hasidic world perceives it, or kind of you are reconstructing obsessions of 12 years old, or 14-year-old, or 15 or 16, 17-year-old boy who is in some way obsessed with sex and uncertainty about his body and development and all those issues. Where is it? I was not sure how to read it. However fascinating it was.
Okay, that's a really good question. And there are people who come from the Hasidic world who tell me that they were not as sheltered, and they say that they knew a lot more. And I believe that is true for some individuals, but it's hard for me to know, what most experience, because I don't have it quantitatively. I don't have any data on this quantitatively, but I do know that my experience was not at all unusual. I've spoken to many, many, many others who say this was a very, very, very precise reflection of their experience. Many, many people have told me that. Both people who are even still in the Hasidic world have told it to me, but many who were there, and many of my present friends who were there, said that this was exactly the way it was for them as well. Here and there are some who say, no, their experience was different, they knew more, but there are always exceptions. And the very fact that I am an exception to the degree that I am indicates that there are others who might also step in certain directions but not go as far as I did. So if you see that the extreme, the implication is that the moderate also exists. So the extreme, in my case, I would say the extreme means someone who leaves completely, indicates that there are those who leave partially. And that leaving could have the form of someone who stays within the community, but just has a much, much more open, curious, and self-allowance, self-permitted exposure to aspects of sex. So for me, it was the way it was, and I know that this was true for many others, but there are those for whom it was very different.
Shulem, please don't say more. We want to whet the appetite for people to read the book, and don't tell them what's in, right? So now they know sex and violence. Go to the book. I would like to, before we come to concluding, I would like to ask you something that might be of interest to our audience back in Eastern Europe. namely the connection. You mentioned this Volhynian connection to Yampol, Karlin-Stolin dynasty, and you mentioned in the book you wanted to visit maybe Prague, maybe Krakow, but then disappointingly to me you mentioned, and then I went to Europe, it was Greece and Spain. Well, nothing close to. Have you ever been to Eastern Europe, to Poland, Ukraine?
So it is a dream to go to Eastern Europe. Why I went to Spain and Greece that time, it was a particularly chaotic period, and Western Europe at that time was the medicine I was seeking for whatever ailed me in that particular month. But I've had a dream to travel all of Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. And well, I should say also right now, I think that's relevant is completely coincidentally, nothing related to the publication of my book, and this actually preceded it, is I've been dating for a year and a half a woman who was born and raised in Rzeszów in Poland. So my present girlfriend is Polish, and
Galicianer.
She's a Galiciana, exactly.
Oy vey.
But at least she doesn't speak Yiddish, so I don't have to hear the Galiciana Yiddish.
Okay, that's good.
But we joke about that. But we very much wanted to come for a visit. First, we were thinking we would travel to Poland this summer, just generally because she often goes to visit her parents sometimes, and I was thinking we would do a trip together. But especially after I learned that the book will be released this time, I was thinking it would be a perfect time for me to come visit. And then the coronavirus crisis and COVID has us all staying home and not going anywhere. I mean, I travel within New York State a little bit. Hotels are open, but international travel was pretty much it came out of the question. Yeah. But it made me so sad that I wasn't able to do this now. But I will still make it to Eastern Europe, and it will be hopefully very soon. And Poland, I mean, I don't know if Polish people know this or appreciate the degree to which this is true, but any child raised in the Hasidic world knows the names of more towns in Poland than in the United States. They can a typical boy raised in, and now they know the Yiddish version, so they will say Lizensk, not Rizhansk, or slightly different. The town of Rzeszów, where my girlfriend is from, in Yiddish they use the German name, which is Reiche. I'm not sure why, but I guess when it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was more German influenced. But the point is, they might not be the exact same names as Polish people know them, but they are names of towns in Poland all across, up and north to south, east to west, way into Belarus and Lithuania and further into the Ukraine, and all of it was central to everything that I knew about our religious worldview. It was towns in Poland and Ukraine and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth generally
but were there in Eastern Europe, or they were somewhere floating in air, like kind of holy skver or
That's
holy
a good question,
but you don't know where it is.
That's a very good question, but I think to a degree that is true, but there is also very much this feeling that when people refer to the Holocaust in the ultra-Orthodox world, the ultra-Orthodox world has a somewhat different perspective or somewhat different attitude as the broader Jewish world, and it is often referred to as Churban Europa, the destruction of Europe. And obviously, they're not talking about Europe as a place; they're talking about Jewish Europe. But there is a recognition that Jewry, particularly Ashkenazi Jewry, was a European thing. And they may have sometimes forgotten that a European thing is also for non-Jews. But there's very much an awareness that Ashkenazi Jewishness and Hasidism in particular come out of European soil. A Jewish European milieu, but European nonetheless. I think there's very much an awareness of that. But you are correct in making that observation, because I think in the same way that Polish people have little awareness of what Polish towns and cities and the Polish geography might mean to Hasidim, I think Hasidim have even less awareness of what Poland means to Poles, what Poland or Eastern Europe means to non-Jews.
I would like to correct that actually there is quite an awareness of importance of Poland for Hasidism, and that's one of the reasons of interest in Hasidism, such a big interest in Hasidism or in general Jewish culture in Poland. That's why this festival is so popular. You can imagine that you have tens of thousands of people coming to the festival concerts. People want to know and people want to learn more about it, even though they might not know the essential, holy sites, because that's fascinating that the geography of Jewish Eastern Europe and Polish Eastern Europe is so totally different. Totally different places are important for them, and they might be as close as Warsaw and Ger, but they are not speaking about the same topography. They don't recognize it.
Right.
That's fascinating.
I find that
we need to return to this topic. Shulem, we have to return to this topic after you come to Poland and you visit all those places, and we'll talk about it
for sure.
Because one more point that we have in common is that my wife is from Rzeszów. I'm not Galician, but my wife is from there. So we'll talk about, what is to be in Rzeszów and how it is to go from Rzeszów via Łódź to Lizensk. So after you do the pilgrimage, we'll return to this topic. We need to be coming to the end. But before we end, I wanted to ask you two more questions. Important to me to know. The book ends at, you say, 2014. When you finish writing this book, it was published 2015, and it is translated as it was in 2015. How your life developed or changed since then?
I just want to add a minor correction. Events in the book generally finish around 2010, with a tiny little bit thrown in of what happened between 2010 and 2014. But essentially, the book ends, the story of the book ends in 2010. I throw in a little hint of what happened, in the 2011, 2012, because I was writing it in 2014, so I could put in a little bit. But the book essentially, I started writing it in 2010, and the story was already shaped at that point. So I think that's just that's important to me from a narrative perspective, to define the scope of the narrative. The scope of the narrative is up to 2010 for the most part. After 2010, what I've been doing, well, I'm mostly in the general sort of field of writing, editing, and translating. So right now, my work is mostly, I do developmental editing, which is people who are in the process of writing a book. They sometimes need help at the macro level, structuring things, moving this chapter here, this chapter there. And so that's over here we call it developmental editing. And so I do that kind of consulting on that. And in addition to that, I do Yiddish to English translating, particularly things for which you cannot use AI. You can't scan it and have Google Translate, because they might be old letters that people have. They're handwritten. No computer can decipher it. You actually need someone not only with deep familiarity of Yiddish and of European Yiddish, which is obviously slightly different from contemporary Yiddish, and you have to also understand the religious milieu in which these people are writing and speaking. And so I provide that, and I do a lot of work around personal documents in Yiddish that people have. So translations. That's in terms of what I do. I always consider myself, though, first and foremost, a writer. Writing is my main interest. I have various other writing projects in the pipeline, but I'm also not in a particular rush. I'm not a person who sort of needs to get something out. This book I wrote, it took me 4 years, and then 1 year of preparation for printing. And It took me 4 years, not because it took me 4 years of furious writing. It took 4 years of slow writing and thinking and putting it away for a month and coming back to it. So that is my style as a writer. And so I'm constantly writing, but haven't yet put out another book just yet. There probably will be one, but I don't know when.
This is the last question. This is the last question. This is my last question.
Okay.
For the advertisement time. Tell us what's next big project. What's coming out next?
Tell us what's next. Well, let me just say, very, very interesting things. Stay tuned.
Okay, so we don't want to.
But in reality,
reveal it. Okay, I get it. Okay, great. Thank you very much. It was great meeting you. Oh, novel.
I'm at work on a novel and an essay collection, but not with any kind of fixed period that I want it to be finished and put out to the public. It's still sitting with me.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
If that helps.
Looking forward really to read it as soon as it is out, hopefully sooner than later. And thank you for, first of all, thank you for bringing this very interesting, beautiful book in Polish to the Polish readership, and for agreeing to talk to me. Thank you.
Of course, and thank you for doing this. It's a great honor, and the book being in Polish is very, very special to me. So I thank everyone who reads it in Polish. It really means a lot to me, and all who've taken an interest.